Hi there. My name is Julian Berman. I'm going to talk a bit about open source and in particular about working on a project of mine that started as a passion project and which is now my day job. First and foremost, I want to thank the organizers and everyone participating in the conference for inviting me. PyGotham is one of my favorite conferences, so certainly an honor to be speaking at it. So thanks. This is me on the internet, I suppose. In particular, I work for Postman, which is an API platform that helps developers across the API lifecycle. And they employ me to work on a project called JSON Schema, which I'm going to talk lots about in this talk. That's me on GitHub. It's just my first name, @Julian. All the open source software that I'm going to talk about is either there or in organizations that my account also does some work in. So you should be able to find links to those, although I'll add them at the end. And then if you care about social media, etc., that's where I do a bit of that stuff on LinkedIn and Mastodon. Of course, everything I say in this talk is me talking. I can't speak for Postman and don't claim to. So I'm very grateful that they employ me to work on this stuff. But all I can do is sort of hypothesize about what motivations anyone may have in employing people in open source and encouraging more companies to do so. So everything I say is, of course, me speaking. So I'm going to talk about a couple of rough topics. As I say, today I work full-time on open source. I'll tell you a bit about how the JSON Schema project and my involvement in it got me here. I'll try and speculate a bit about what of my journey is reproducible and how it might reoccur for you. As I was sort of putting this together, I also had some reflections in general about what the past 10 or 15 years have been like. So I'll share some of those. And then I'll tell you a bit more about what's next for JSON Schema or open source for JSON Schema at the end. So it's probably good to start with context on what in the world JSON Schema is. So here's a 60-second, incredibly simplified view of what it is. So we have here a piece of JSON in Python, perhaps something that you get from calling json.loads. So that would be a Python list that comes from a JSON array with the numbers 1, 12, and 37. And you might have lots of data like that that you're collecting together. And you might know that the schema for all of that data, or the kind of form that all of them take or should take, are non-empty lists of positive numbers. So maybe the list containing the number 3 is also okay, as is the list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But some bad examples, so -9, 2 is not okay because it's not a list of positive numbers, nor is that list of strings there. And so JSON lets you store all of these data entities, but what JSON Schema does is it gives you a language, also itself often represented as JSON, so you can see it on the right there, that lets you express the constraints that you want your data to hold, or to have, excuse me. So these blue keywords are JSON Schema keywords. They're sort of the tools that you can use to express constraints. So here I'm saying I've got something which is a type array, so a JSON array, so a Python list. It's got at least one item, so that's what that min items keyword does. And then the items keyword says each of the items in the list is supposed to be a number, which is at least 1. So hopefully you can sort of see that that object on the right, which I've explained what each of the keywords does, altogether sort of expresses this constraint of non-empty lists of positive numbers. Now, of course, this is a simple example. There are there's a whole library of keywords that JSON Schema offers to express various constraints. Of course, both for lists, for JSON arrays, as well as for objects, Python dictionaries. So there's lots and lots of keywords that you can use to express constraints. All that being said, just to share, JSON schema is not fully expressive, so there you can sort of quickly get out of the set of things that JSON schema can express. So if I want to express that this list is a increasing list of positive numbers, so 1, 12, 37, and not 3, 1, 2, you can't, or at least none of the built-in keywords allow you to express that sort of constraint. And then in general is okay. So JSON schema lets you express lots of constraints that you may want to put on your data, but not necessarily all. And there are mechanisms for extending JSON schema beyond the built-in keywords. But that's the basic idea. You've got some data, you want to write down a schema for that data, and you're generally going to have both of those in either JSON or a format that's sort of representable in JSON's model. So that's all the sort of raw background I'll give for what JSON schema is. In terms of how it's organized, there's the JSON schema specification, which defines all those keywords that I showed examples of. That's a collection of around 5 to 10 people, at times even more than that, at times less, who are active. I participate as one of many, one of that larger group. It's an open specification, so you can get involved in that specification. That specification sort of guides what keywords exist, how are they supposed to work, and how JSON schema is supposed to function as a whole. Then on the other side, there are implementations of JSON schema. Those are little bits of software, programs, which implement the specification. And there I also participate. In that world, I have an implementation of JSON schema in Python, which takes the specification and sort of implements those keywords so that you can validate documents in Python. Slightly confusingly, that implementation is called JSON schema. So it's import JSON schema in Python. So I'll try and, during this talk at least, I'll try and differentiate between when I'm talking about the specification and when I'm talking about the Python implementation. But you can find the specification at that URL, jsonschema.org. There's a GitHub organization where development happens. I'll include a link to that at the end. But as I say, that's a collection of people all trying to decide how JSON schema should work across languages. And then there are implementations, of which I maintain one of them, called JSON schema in Python, or Python JSON schema, which implements the specification for Python. So I participate in both of these groups. JSON schema is sort of important in the broader API landscape, so across more of the API world, because it's used within other higher level specifications like OpenAPI or Async API or others that you may have heard of. Those are specifications that take something like JSON schema and use them to specify what your API request or response needs to look like, but then bundles that with other information like what paths on your web server do they live at. So sort of taking the structure of data portion that JSON schema provides and combining it with the rest of what you need to define an API or create clients or servers or what have you. And then, of course, there's all sorts of tooling that are built on top of those specifications, which ultimately are using JSON schema in one way or another. The point being, if you've heard of any of the middle layer here, then you're potentially already using JSON schema if you don't necessarily know it. Of course, in the API landscape, JSON is the most prevalent data format. And so JSON schema, which is sort of giving this way of schematizing JSON documents, is pretty popular. So 100% of my time at Postman, from when I've been hired, my remit was essentially to focus entirely on those two pillars. So to focus both on my own implementation and also on the broader ecosystem, whether that's helping with the specification or writing tooling that helps the broader JSON schema ecosystem. So it's been about a year. I joined in June of 2022, and Postman's hired me along with others, for at least 4 others within JSON schema and many more in other specifications whose remit is essentially furthering these open source projects. in terms of JSON schema in Python and my own path towards getting to this point. So how did I get towards working on open source full time? There's sort of two parallel timelines here. This can obviously be a bit to take in, but if I just sort of read the top, that's my professional software development timeline. I would say I started in software development around 2009. From there until 2017, I was an individual contributor. And then from 2017 all the way up until 2022, really, I was in sort of engineering leadership or broader leadership positions, including during an acquisition, leading up until 2022, where I joined Postman. In parallel, in the background, I was working on my Python implementation. So that's the sort of bottom timeline there. So my Python implementation started in 2011. You can see the commit message there, December 29th, 2011. Around 2014 was when I saw the first dollar, someone essentially donating money towards it. Not that I mean to say that was a big initial motivation, but 2014 was when I made the first dollar off of the implementation. By around 2016, I had probably ramped down a bit of work on the project, given that my work life was getting busier, and I suppose I was getting less interested in the project at that point. And again, around 2019, dollars of donation picked up slightly. I'll say more about that in a minute. All of which led up again to me joining Postman in 2022, for which I can say just a little mini milestone that the Python project, my Python project, crossed 25 million weekly downloads a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago. This graph here is a graph of number of releases that the Python implementation has seen per year. I know it's not necessarily going to be readable, but you can just see that the big bar on the right, which represents 2022, is quite a bit larger than the bars on the left, because there was a big uptick in work, as you can imagine, once I was dedicated full time towards working on it. So quite lucky to now be dedicated full time towards improving the project and working on JSON schema more broadly. Just to be even more specific about how different working for Postman is than previously, this is around what I was making per month off the project for the past 10 years or so. As I say, I would get ad hoc donations. This is monthly. I would get ad hoc donations as early as 2013 or 2014, around a year or two into the project. Not many people remember GitHub or GratiPay, but Chad Whitaker deserves more credit, or at least I don't see his name necessarily recognized as much, perhaps as it used to be. That was a good period, at least for me, in terms of, at least on this timeline, getting some support for working on JSON schema. Then, of course, when GratiPay disappeared around 2017, so did the income stream, really, until Tidelift and GitHub sponsors came along. But none of that is at all any comparison towards full-time work on the project. So with Postman, thankfully, the amount that gets put towards JSON schema on a monthly basis is more like a normal salary at this point. So I would just say about this elementary graph here, that all I mean to say is that money was never really the reason for creating the project, but without being able to justify focusing on the project for longer periods of time, it gets a lot harder to do month-long or 2-month-long projects, or things that take 80 hours plus, like I'll mention in a little bit. If you're on the order of magnitude of some of the earlier dots here, whereas of course, if I'm working day in, day out on it, those longer term projects become a lot easier to focus on. I'll say for Postman in particular, they're not just Postman. We are not just investing in JSON schema. This is a screenshot from the Postman Open Technologies page, which is the name of the team that I work on. And Postman's invested in a bunch of the specifications that I've called out earlier, along with some others, and is really putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to supporting the open source space. I of course, believe that this is mutually beneficial, that Postman gets plenty out of their support for open source, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. But the investment is across various specifications, JSON schema being one of them. I thought I would mention as well, a year into working on JSON schema, the two main deliverables, or the two main large chunks of work that I've managed to complete. The first one is a Python library called referencing. Precisely what it does is slightly technical. If you're familiar with JSON schema, then what it does is implement the $ref keyword, which we saw a bunch of other keywords earlier. The $ref keyword is a keyword that lets you interlink schemas with each other, or really take a schema that lives somewhere else and say, I want to apply the conditions that live in this schema as part of a larger one. It can get quite complicated, and actually building this library, which, as I say, was meant for improving support for that $ref keyword, was months of work. Of course, with a couple of other things happening at the same time, but was large numbers of hours of work. It was written as a secondary library, so I took my JSON schema library, left it as is, wrote a referencing library, or a library called, wrote a library called referencing. Let's get back here. Wrote a library called referencing on the side. You can find its documentation there. And took that referencing library and plugged it back into my JSON schema library in order to improve the level of support that my library had. But that referencing library is usable by other JSON schema tooling, so it's also sort of a self-contained bit of work. When that implementation was merged back into mine, I was able to close around 25 open issues on my Python implementation, because this was an area of common where users were having lots of trouble. There's still more work to be done there, and in truth, the integration with my library, I suspect, will take another 6 months or so to stabilize. But it's way more compliant than it was before with the specification. So I'm not going to deep dive through referencing, but as I say, the docs are there. The other major thing that I've done in the past year is something called Bowtie. That's the URL for it there, although I'll show you a screenshot in a moment. Bowtie is not specific to my Python implementation. What Bowtie does is there are implementations of JSON schema across many environments and libraries, and they have different levels of compliance with the specification for various reasons, either because the spec is hard to implement, or there was a piece that isn't yet done, or what have you. But it can be difficult as a user who's trying to pick a JSON schema implementation to understand the faults that your implementation may have, or the open issues that it may have. What Bowtie does is it integrates with 20 different JSON schema implementations across 13 different programming languages. Each of those numbers are growing over time as more are integrated. And it will sort of tell you across various implementations which parts of the specification they properly implement or do not. It was also a Google Summer of Code project. At least the front end of it was a Summer of Code project this year. And if you go to that website, you'll see something like this screenshot, which is just a portion of the page, but it's essentially telling you across 10 or so implementations how many of what we call the JSON schema test suite those implementations pass or fail. So you can, again, of course, use this as a user who's trying to understand different implementations, what issues they have, or if you have multiple choices in a library, which one might you want to choose over another. So that's bowtie. If I start to think about why companies would want to sponsor open source in the way that I'm quite lucky to be sponsored, again, I speak not for Postman, so I just have to sort of offer some thoughts here on how I think about these things. The most obvious reason is, of course, to make sure that specifications or software that the for-profit company depends on continue to grow. As I said earlier, even though something like JSON schema is a reasonably healthy open source project, if I think about my Python implementation, there are certain projects that never would have happened, like referencing, unless I was able to focus 80 hours straight on just that. It's just too hard to justify those long-term projects if you have other things going on that are sort of distracting you and taking away from brain space. Secondly, for a company is showing, like, again, putting your money where your mouth is really, and sort of demonstrating that you're a good open source citizen, that you're supporting the ecosystem, and that you're not just sort of taking money out of the ecosystem and not reinvesting in keeping open source healthy. So that I think is another important angle for why companies might be interested in doing this. Sort of relatedly, it's beneficial to companies working alongside open source developers when you're reliant on those projects. You of course get access to expertise. So I of course am available for and provide expertise on the specification or on tooling or on anything related to peers who are working on projects that essentially interact with JSON schema, and that's beneficial despite the fact that I'm not working on those other internal projects. Again, of course, this is true of the broader team, all of the people who are working across specifications. Quite similarly, there are relationships that otherwise wouldn't get built, which make this kind of open source subsidizing attractive. So, me making personal relationships with people who are building internal related projects, that's not necessarily something that would happen organically without having a direct working relationship. I think the last kind of maybe straightforward reason why particularly hiring employees to work on open source might be attractive is because companies are used to hiring people as a mechanism for basically giving money. So to be less roundabout about it, pulling off money to donate or to send as a ongoing or a one-off donation is maybe newer or more different than simply hiring an employee and having the employment be the way of supporting a developer. So perhaps this is another reason why hiring someone and allowing them to continue to work on open source is a good way of supporting projects. Okay, let me say a little bit about changes to JSON schema itself, to the project. There of course are small ones, no real major impact, kind of giant impactful ones, other than thankfully there's more activity on the project. But there is one perceived change that we keep in mind, which is trying to make sure to counteract any perceptions that your open source project is now being influenced by a corporation or a company or what have you. I'm trying to be both general and specific. In the case of Postman, no one is telling me do this thing for the JSON schema project, nor anyone else. The people who are working on the project are still keeping the same stakeholders in mind when it comes to the good of the specification or my project or anyone else's project. But it is still important to manage perception so that other people don't think or suspect that there really is any interference going on. So this is an active thing that those of us working on the project have to counteract by basically making sure we actively encourage voices outside of those working for Postman to participate. The second sort of change, I think, has to do with working on an open source project where now there's a significant imbalance in how much time contributors are giving to the project. So if I take myself, for example, before I was full-time employed in Postman, with Postman, I was maybe putting in, somewhere less than 5 hours a week on JSON schema. And there are other volunteers on JSON schema, the project, who are still putting in, that around that order of magnitude of time. But when Postman goes and hires a bunch of people to work on the project, of course, now there are people who are putting in 40 hours of time of work a week on the project, like myself at the minute. And there's an imbalance there between the people who are still volunteers and the people who are working full-time. So it's important not to have the same expectations of everyone and really to be realistic as a project, that sometimes the critical path towards merging a pull request or issues or what have you goes through people who are still volunteers. And that we're quite lucky that we can focus full-time, but that doesn't mean that we should try pressing the gas pedal faster than others are able to. I'm going to talk quickly about open source as your daily job as opposed to a commercial project. This may differ depending on which open source project you work on, but of course I'll speak about JSON schema. It's of course less easy as an open source project to understand who your key stakeholders are and how you satisfy them. When you're working for a company, it's quite clear usually who your stakeholders are, and at least in a healthy company, kind of what direction you head in order to drive your key metrics, which is making more money essentially. For an open source project, that's a bit less obvious, both who those people are and what you should be doing to satisfy them, and also what metric you're optimizing towards if it's not making more money. So in the case of JSON schema, again, we have to sort of learn what to do there and kind of proactively solicit opinions and ideas and understand what difficulties people are having when using JSON schema out in the world. Again, I speak both for the specification and also for my library in that case. And you have to be proactive about looking for pain points and trying to understand how to prioritize fixing those. Role clarity is, I suppose, definitely no easier, I don't think, than when you're working on a traditional product, let's say. I think in an open source project, people are sort of used to picking up whatever loose ends are needed in order to move the project forward. And once that's your job, again, the imbalance in particular can make it seem like you're stepping on other people's toes pretty easily. So I think it is important in open source projects in particular to understand who's doing what. And we definitely still struggle with that, but it's an interesting problem to try and solve on a professional level. And then you sort of have occasions where work is stop and go. Again, you could be working on something and then have to stop because it's dependent on someone who's not working on JSON schema full time and hasn't yet offered an opinion. And you have to sort of put that on pause and work on something else. And so you may have a bunch of different things all in progress at the same time. That happens, of course, at times in traditional work. But I think it probably happens a bit more often for us. Long-term planning for open source, if it's your job, is also not very easy. In the case of JSON schema, we have a roadmap now as of this year for kind of longer-term things we want to make sure happen. But it does take active focus both to decide and agree on sort of what we think the longer-term goals are for the project, and then also making sure that we get those done and focus energy on them. And then the last thing I think to me is that on any open source project, my experience is that the culture of that project and what it's like to work on that project, even within paid work, is very dependent on the personalities that you're working with. So certainly that's true of JSON schema. And as I say, of any other project I've ever worked on. What can I say about how repeatable this is? I of course don't think that there's one formula for how you develop an open source project that a company will be interested in, and be interested in sponsoring you working on. So there isn't just one path towards getting there, I don't think. If there's one thing that definitely was necessary, although maybe not sufficient, it was persistently keeping the project maintained and making it clear that there was an intention that this be usable and useful for others. So for me, certainly, I wouldn't be here if I hadn't spent the 10 years essentially maintaining JSON schema on the side. For some projects, I suspect the level of persistence is shorter rather than longer, so it may not take 10 years before this is obvious. But for some, I think it may. I think in particular, the API industry might be ahead of others here because it lives closer to the specifications that it's dependent on, by which I mean it's more obvious, I think, to companies like Postman how useful those specifications are to their business, and that makes them more invested or want to be more invested in making sure those kind of underlying specifications and projects are successful. So that I think helps make it easier to justify the investment for companies in an industry that's tech-driven like that, or that might be a bit tech-driven. I do think that in general, this is a sort of win for open specifications. So I have quite a bit to thank for the overall JSON schema project, because it's an open specification that became popular, that many different people were able to use because of its openness and its development. And it's that popularity really that that made it sticky in a bunch of places, and therefore increased the amount of opportunity there is for someone like me to get paid for it. So I think another sort of recommendation I would have, if you're trying to replicate this in other places, is find open specifications within your industry. Many of them have some, I know from previous lives in other industries, and investing either in software within those specifications or in somehow working in that realm is I think a path towards turning open source work into paid work. Another thing I would say is I have to say I pick out opportunities, cases recently where JSON schema's original authorship was essentially because I needed something for data validation, and I didn't just want to write something that would be useful only for myself. I sort of used that opportunity as a way to produce a library that maybe someone else would want to use. And it turned out that yes, other people did want to use it. So I think it's important to look for these kinds of opportunities where you can do a little bit of extra work, and maybe come out of that with a reusable piece of software that someone may be interested in, perhaps for pay. Another obvious idea, of course, is to look at existing critical projects and to just join them and become experts in them, or an expert in them. I know this is something I myself tried to do historically, is to take a project where at very least I could learn how to be a better software developer by making use of code reviews or other developers on the project sort of teaching me things. So I think this is another way of sort of monetizing yourself, is learning about existing critical projects that you can join up with. And then on the other side, if you're at a company and you control budget or you have some sort of internal influence, I think it is going to improve the situation for all of us if you advocate for direct open source support in whatever form that takes. So of course, hiring open source developers like myself, but also donations or Tidelift or GitHub sponsors or whatever you can sell internally, talking to others, having answers to questions like, why would we pay for software that's free? All of this sort of thing is healthy for the ecosystem. Just some reflections on my 10 years plus of JSON schema becoming my job at this point. Of course, as I say, sometimes you create something that's just a side project and it becomes the main project. So when I wrote JSON schema, it was needed because I was writing a web application, and that web application needed data validation. And so I learned about JSON schema and wrote a side project. Of course, that web application never materialized and is long forgotten. I don't even remember what it was about, but JSON schema is still here. I don't think that's that uncommon in open source. Again, if I mention Twisted, Glyph, I think, tells a similar story about how Twisted was written originally for a game, but the game never happened and Twisted did. So I think in open source, sometimes the side project does become distracting or successful enough. I think also another thing that I would be transparent about is falling out of love with the project and sort of having less passion than you did at some point in time. Having it be your job is not the reason why I personally might not be as passionate as I was historically. I mentioned all the way at the front that probably around 2017 I was already spending less time on the library than I had previously. So at some point, if it's this software project that becomes really popular, I think you don't necessarily always maintain passion, or at least I am jealous of folks who do. But I think that's okay. I think, number one, it being your job to some extent helps there. It's easier to focus on something if you know that it's not just your hobby project. So, a hobby that you have no passion for, I suppose, is harder to work on than your job. So that's definitely helped me. And there are ups and downs. There's times where when I'm working on some particular project, some particular problem within JSON schema that grabs my interest and that I can have a bit more passion for. So there's sort of ups and downs there. JSON schema has been quite humbling for me as well. I would have at various times been quite proud to say that it's really well tested, but it's also had a ton of bugs over its 12 or whatever number of years. So I'm talking about my Python library again in this case, including bugs where you say, wow, that should be impossible. I think there's a test that covers that. And sure enough, you find one. So I have to reflect on just being humbled by how many bugs something that you might think was simple or you might think was well tested can have. I also would reflect on how valuable it's been to have cross-language tooling. So I mentioned how many implementations of Bowtie how many implementations of JSON schema there are across languages, and Bowtie being a tool for helping bring those together. But sort of what got me into the broader JSON schema ecosystem in the first place was writing a cross-language test suite. So a suite of test cases that you could use across any implementation in any language. That was what got me started in the first place with the specification. So that idea or that work is definitely key to getting where I am right now. And I'll just repeat again, procrastinating in a productive way. So that's finding new side projects. Whether, when I recently, a couple of months ago, when I was making a change to JSON schema, I needed a new data structure. And again, rather than making that data structure be something internal that's only useful for JSON schema, I sort of made that data structure be its own new library in the hopes that it will itself grow legs and sort of sprout its own little community. All right, just to tie things up on what's next. JSON schema, the specification, is very focused on stability, making itself more compatible from one release to the next. making development of the specification more sustainable. Of course, we're quite thankful for Postman helping out there in making at least the amount of effort that we dedicate more sustainable. And then growing the community and growing the number of implementations and tools. There's a push to stop making breaking changes. There's a push to make the specification more extensible, to improve quality of implementations. That's why something like Bowtie is helpful. Really just to take the good time that we're in now and sort of help grow the community. For my implementation in particular, as I say, I spent a decent portion of the last year writing a tool like referencing. There are other implementations of JSON schema for Python, and me writing that kind of tool was really at least acknowledgement that I want to grow JSON schema in the Python community in general, not just within my own implementation. So I think having more implementations is good. Having more JSON schema tooling in Python is good. Having more OpenAPI tooling in Python is good. Really trying to provide a suite of tools across the language. So I want to do more of that and kind of grow more tools within the Python ecosystem. And then I as I sort of hinted to before, JSON schema is of course one thing that I'm interested in. And it's always hard struggling with yourself, trying to make sure that you don't kind of put yourself in a box in terms of what you're interested in software-wise. So it is a struggle for me trying to place how much time I spend on JSON schema, regardless of the fact that it's my job. I enjoy it. As I say, I find good technical problems to deal with, but I'm quite realistic. And I do hope that the world of open source in general expands and has more opportunities like this one, and opportunities with wider remit. So really, I'm just sort of realistic there about where I am today, and hopefully benefiting the community, while also knowing that my interest does wax and wane at points in time. So this is a screenshot of some repos in the Python ecosystem that I've either collaborated on with others or am growing. As I say, Bowtie on the right is still an active area throughout the entire JSON schema landscape. And that's what I had to say. You can find links to learning more about JSON schema on the JSON schema website up there, as well as links to the GitHub for JSON schema if you want to get involved. If you want to learn more about my implementation, the organization in GitHub is the second link there. If you want to help out or investigate Bowtie, the third link is the Bowtie GitHub organization. The website for just viewing Bowtie reports is just bowtie.report. And then I screenshotted the Postman open philosophy page. But if you want to learn more about Postman's investment in open source, that's the bottom link there. So you can have a look. Or of course, if you want to peruse open job roles and what have you, that's also there. So again, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I want to thank you all for listening. And I guess the last thing I would say is if you somehow need help in some way that you think I can help you in getting into open source or in expanding your role in open source or whatever it is, if you think that I can help you, please feel free to reach out and I'll do what I can. Thanks.